Hello everybody, I've been promising this one for a long time, but it took a lot of research to do this one, probably more than any other IRL character profile I've done, or that I may do. That's because it's just such a massive topic to cover, and it's not just one person I'm doing here, but two. I'm not just covering the most significant person in Argentina's history, but the two most significant people in Argentina's political history. And you can't really talk about Evita without talking about Juan. So just a couple notes. This is going to be really long, and I mean really long. And that's not because I'm stretching it out or anything. There's just a lot of stuff to cover. We're dealing with an extended period. We're dealing with a bunch of Argentina's history, etc. So I'm going to be drawing from both the musical Evita, which is not entirely historical accurate, but I think gives a really good kind of overview of the ideas and kind of how people were viewed during the time period, and the biography of Eva Peron by Nicholas Fraser and Marissa Navarro. I'm going to mispronounce a lot of this stuff, and if I get some things kind of mixed up, I apologize, but like I said, it's just a massive topic to cover. So without further ado, let's get into this. So let's talk a bit about Argentina first. Now, out of all the South American countries, Argentina is probably the most European in terms of its focus. Argentina's always liked to present itself as being the Europe of the Americas. They like to view themselves, I think Buenos Aires used to be called the Paris of South America. They're definitely, I believe, the most European descended country. It's a frequent meme that 97% of the population put European down. The population, my understanding, is largely Spanish and Italian. There's some debate as to which is more prevalent, Spanish or Italian. But it's overwhelmingly European, and it took the architecture and other things took inspiration from a variety of different sources: Spain, France, Germany, and England. So there's a lot of different influences, and the upper class in Argentina has always tried to imitate the... So Argentina had been governed by the National Autonomous Party for a lengthy period of time, which was rather conservative. Argentina, largely as a result of wars in Europe, also as well as its kind of unique position. Argentina, as some of you may know, is, I believe, the largest producer of beef on Earth, or at least the largest per capita producer of beef on Earth. But it's always been a very wealthy country. Prior to the Great Depression, Argentina was probably in the top 5 wealthiest countries per capita on Earth. And there is the expression in Paris, rich as an Argentine, to describe how wealthy the country is. However, following the Great Depression, the country never really recovered. And we have a military coup, we have a bunch of stuff going on, and it eventually enters a period called the infamous decade. The infamous decade is the duration of the 1930s, in which a combination of conservative landowners, capitalists, and I guess kind of the rest of the upper class society had a system of fraudulent elections to maintain power. Actually, there's even a term for it. It was called patriotic fraud. So they just continually kept running. I think Agustin B. Justo is one of them, but there was a number of them. So it was a time of fraud. It was a time of repression of the political opposition, which was mainly the Liberal Party, the Radical Civic Union, and there was also widespread corruption. There was a number of large-scale corruption scandals throughout this time period. Now, I know people here will have various views on having electoral fraud and taking down political opposition. I don't mean to say it's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying that's the way it was. And the fact that Argentinians to this day refer to it as the infamous decade shows that they regard it as a period of corruption and incompetence. So around this time period, we enter Juan Domingo Peron, which I'm probably mispronouncing. So Peron was a Sicilian / Spanish / French Basque, which is kind of an interesting combination. Actually, it's interesting because much like Napoleon, who francified his name from Bonaparte to Bonaparte, Peron's initial name was Peroni, but they made it to Peron to sound more Spanish. So from my understanding, I think his family was middle class. It's a little ambiguous in what I read. But at a fairly young age, he went to the National Military College. And at the age of 16, he was remarked to have excelled a lot more in athletics than studies. Peron, both in terms of appearance, stature, and manner, really kind of cultivated the image of machismo, of kind of being a man's man. So when Peron began his career in the military, the first thing he kind of made his name for was he mediated a prolonged labor conflict at the place where he was stationed. And this would kind of become a recurring theme even throughout his early career, that whenever there was a labor conflict, the government would bring him in to negotiate. He was very good at mediating between the government and the various labor people. So there was the military coup. There was there's the infamous decade, and during this time, Juan Peron taught military history at the major military academy in Argentina, published a number of treatises on the subject. He also served as the military attaché to the Argentine embassy in Chile. Now, it's interesting, and we'll talk about this when we get to Peron's supervisor, but I would imagine any kind of high-ranking post in diplomacy between Argentina and Brazil and Argentina and Chile would be extremely prestigious given the proximity. So, Peron was assigned by the Ministry of War to study mountain warfare in the Italian Alps. He had been a military ski instructor, probably due to his skill in sports. So he attended the University of Turin for a semester, and he traveled across Europe as a military observer. So he was very interested in fascism when he was there, and he studied Italian fascism quite a bit. He also studied Nazi Germany and various governments at the time. He wrote a book about what he viewed there, and he saw social democracy as a viable alternative to liberal democracy. He also disliked totalitarianism. He viewed liberal democracy as ruled by the wealthy, and he viewed totalitarianism as being overly repressive. Now, his description of social democracy, as we'll see, is kind of different than how most people do. I kind of consider Peronism, and we'll get into this later, like I said, this is going to be really long, as right-wing socialism. So now we're going to talk a bit about Evita before we get into it. So born Eva Duarte, I'm probably mispronouncing that. She came from a very poor family, a very poor rural family, a fact that she frequently would talk about throughout her life. So she was also descendant from French Basque and Spanish Basque. There are a lot of Basques in the New World. The Basques kind of had a privileged position, particularly in Spain of that time period. It's interesting, when the Carlist Wars came about, the Basques supported the forces of reaction and a strong centralized monarchy, because the monarchs of Spain had been really good to them over the years. So basically, her family was extremely poor, and at some point in time she got into her head the idea that she wanted to be an actress. Now, there's different people, there's different points of view on this. In the movie Evita, it's implied that she has an affair with a famous musician and then threatens to tell his wife if he won't take her to Buenos Aires. However, a lot of other biographers say that this is a smear against her. The family of Evita, and we can, by the way, Evita is a nickname. I believe it means Little Eva. It's kind of an affectionate thing. So Eva's family can contest that their mother, thinking their daughter, or her daughter had some natural talent, took her to audition for a radio show in Buenos Aires and arranged for her to live with family friends there. This seems a bit more accurate. It kind of seems a bit weird for some kind of rural girl to just suddenly be sleeping around with everybody. The idea of a mother taking her daughter to the city to audition for a radio show seems pretty. That makes sense to me. It should be noted, Eva had black hair, but she eventually dyed her hair blonde and kept it for the rest of her life. Eva is considered to be a remarkable beauty, which is partially what kind of launched her movie career and was part of the reason the public was so captivated by her. If you look at her, you can really tell her Basque background. I find Basques tend to have a very specific look to them, very kind of broad Cro-Magnon faces, and she really has that. Anyways, so when she was there, Eva began to get a lot of jobs. She worked as a model because she was pretty. She began to get roles in various plays. She got kind of bit parts in radio stations. She got to be in B-grade movie melodramas. She worked in a bunch of soap operas. So she was fairly successful, particularly for a woman of her time. Now, a lot of people criticize her as being a bad actress. How good she was an actress or not, I don't know. But it should be noted the way people acted back then. I don't mean behaved on a daily basis. I mean acted in movies and stuff was very different. Especially in a country in South America. It was a lot more expressionist, a lot more over the top. It wasn't really realistic. Her breakout role, though, was she played Queen Elizabeth the First in the last Tsarina of Russia in a big play. So she was eventually started to make a lot of money. She co-founded a radio company, and she was earning, it says, 5,000 to 6,000 pesos a month. I don't know how much that is, but it lists her as one of the highest paid radio actresses in the nation, so it's a lot. So she was in a bunch of films. None of them were hugely successful, but they were a pretty steady paycheck. So, yeah. So what eventually happened is she became one of the founders of kind of the big Argentine radio syndicate. So back to Juan Peron for a minute. So there is a subsection in the Army called the United GOU, or United Officers Corps. They were a mixture of Army officers who were dedicated to ending the infamous decade. They basically just wanted to come in, cleanse the rampant corruption and incompetence that had been plaguing the Argentine state, and the series of fraudulent elections, etc. So there's a lot of different theories as to what the GOU's ideology was, and indeed kind of a lack of a coherent ideology was kind of an issue they experienced when they came to power. Broadly speaking, the dominant ideology of the GOU was nationalism. I think there's also a Argentinian ideology that's called like nationalist. I can't pronounce it, it's Spanish. So they took a whole bunch of different things in kind of the ideology of the GOU. There was kind of traditional conservatism. A lot of them were very devout Catholics. There was a lot of them that had kind of like come from workers' backgrounds. It was kind of a mixture of different things. I suppose you could kind of call it paternalist kind of traditionalism. Or not exactly true. It wasn't, a lot of people compare it to fascism because it had kind of reactionary and modernist components. And it's not a completely inaccurate way of describing it. At the same time, though, I don't think you can really argue Peronism is a totalitarian ideology. It has aspects of it, but I don't really think it is fascism, even though that's probably what it's the most like. But anyways, the infamous decade came to an end when the GOU launched a successful military coup. It's kind of funny because the head of the Navy briefly declared himself president due to a miscommunication, but he resigned within 48 hours. Then he was succeeded by another man, and then another man, and they were kind of switching presidents every couple of months. Eventually what would happen is Peron, working behind the scenes, would back his former commander, actually, who became president, and Peron became vice president. Before that point in time, though, how significant Peron was within the GOU and as in the military coup is open to a lot of interpretation. Some people view him as the puppet master the whole time. Other people view him as rising in power as time went on. There's a lot of different perspectives on it. So he was made the Minister of Labor, which at the time was extremely insignificant. We'll get to Argentina's social welfare in a little bit, but he made the Department of Labor into a major force in the government. Working conditions dramatically improved under Peron. He, continuing something he'd done throughout his career previously, succeeded in negotiating between owners and the working class. Out of probably everyone in government, he was the only one who had earned the love of the lower classes of Argentina. So basically, most of the leftist factions within Argentina had begun to kind of coalesce behind Peron. Socialists and syndicalists. The largest union in Argentina, which is the largest union to this day, is called the CGT, which started off as a syndicalist, I guess kind of communist union. They, kind of ideologically different than Peron. They decided to support him because they thought he was the best hope of having a kind of a pro-labor leader in office. So Peron also got himself promoted to the Secretary of War. So he's the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of War, and Vice President, which made him extremely powerful. It's interesting because in Peronist historiography, his former commander, who he was the vice president under, is never referred to as a dictator. So it was around this time in the 1944 when there was a massive earthquake in the Andes range city of San Juan. It completely destroyed the city and it killed 10,000 people. So this was not a small disaster. So Peron the current leader of the junta asked Peron, because he was a man of the people, to kind of coordinate the relief efforts. So Peron did something kind of we see this a lot now, but he kind of organized. He got all the film celebrities together. He got like musicians. He got public intellectuals. He got this big collection of famous Argentines together, and they all raised huge amounts of money for the relief victims. And it got him a lot of public approval. It did a lot of good for the relief victims. And when he was there, he met Eva Duarte, and she immediately, at the charity ball, became his mistress. Now, the relationship between the two has been a subject of a lot of criticism. I see no reason to not say that they didn't love each other. I think it's pretty obvious, especially in Evita when they have the song You Must Love Me. Well, their relationship, I guess, was kind of complicated over time. Overall, they had a very successful and ultimately loving partnership that lasted over a decade, or I guess around a decade. So, Peron did a bunch of other things. He instituted the first national social insurance system. He implemented a lot of minimum wage laws. He implemented yearly bonuses. He did maximum hours. He brought in vacation hours. He did a whole bunch of other stuff. So a lot of people are probably going, well, Argent, this guy just sounds like a complete socialist. And there were socialist aspects to Peron's thought. I think it's important to note that much like Napoleon, men like Peron don't come out of nowhere. Men like Peron come out when the elites prove themselves incapable of dealing with deep-set issues in society. The working conditions were often quite horrible during this time period before labor unions succeeded in passing laws. Now, people may think it's weird that I'm talking about unions as a positive, but you have to understand, well, I'm a rightist, I'm also a Catholic. We'll get into this in a minute, but Peron's political party, the Justicialist Party, Justicialism is a mixture of social and justice. So it's basically the social justice party. Now, before people start freaking out, what social justice initially was it was a Catholic movement that was developed in a response to Marxism and communism. The idea was to foster cooperation between the classes. And I think you can broadly describe it as a fair shake for the working class. The church believed that people should all share in the prosperity the Industrial Revolution brought. That now that there was a lot more excess production, people weren't struggling to basically survive anymore. Workers should get vacations. People should get paid more fairly, etc. It really doesn't have anything to do with modern social justice. It was about ensuring kind of basic rights and a basic standard of living for the working class. And I don't really see what's wrong with that, to be honest. So that was kind of all the stuff that happened. So him and Evita proved to be a very powerful combo, and he just kept rising more and more in power. Eventually what happened, though, a lot of the, I guess you could say more, I don't know if you call them capitalists, just less populist proponents of the regime decided that Peron was just too much of a threat, especially given the fact that all the unions were backing him at this point. So they performed kind of an internal coup and arrested Peron. During this time period, Evita fled, and there's a bunch of different theories as to this. The movie Evita and some of the Peronists contend that Evita went out and helped to rally the trade unions, that she gave some big epic speech and rallied the unions in support of her husband. Or sorry, soon-to-be husband, because they got married afterwards. Other people... So some people think she rallied the support of the unions. Other people think she just hid because she didn't have any political power at this point. The truth could be somewhere in between. I'm not sure exactly. It makes for a better narrative if she helped to rally the people. So what happened was Peron was arrested, but you have to keep in mind the working class loved Peron. They saw him as their guy. He was the one who had dramatically improved their standards of living. He was the one who they felt given them a fair shake. Peron's supporters came to be known as descamisados, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, which is Spanish for the shirtless ones. It's kind of a double entendre. It means shirtless in the sense that they worked outside at hard labor and they took their shirts off because they were too hot. It also meant people who were so poor they couldn't own a shirt. Now, were there people actually so poor they couldn't own a shirt? No, but it's kind of an expression. But they turned out en masse, and there was general strikes. Argentina basically just collapsed. The economy just completely stalled, and the military regime eventually released Peron, and him and Eva were married shortly after. It was around this time that the military decided that it was time to return to democracy, and Peron emerged as the leader of the Labour Party, apparently modeled after the British Labour Party. The official ideology of the Labour Party was national syndicalism, which is kind of a variant of fascism, I guess. It was kind of this strange syncretic thing. And it was around this time that Eva had founded a union of radio and television and movie performers, and she had gotten a daily program called Towards a Better Future, which was largely a dramatization of the accomplishments of her husband. And she would play Peron's speeches. She would just talk about him as the salvation of the nation. So she was actively promoting him. She presented herself correctly as a kind of a rags to riches story who had kind of finally obtained social respectability through her soon-to-be husband. From what I'm reading here, about 300,000 people gathered to demand Peron's release. So Peron won in a landslide in the 1946 election. After he became president, he dissolved the Labour Party and formed the Justicialist Party. So this is when we really kind of get into Peronism. So Peronism is a ideology that really kind of defies easy explanation. It's certainly populist. Populist is probably the best way to describe it. But it was a wide range of different groups. On one hand, Peronism enjoyed very widespread support from Catholics. And keep in mind, everyone in Argentina was basically Catholic. So I mean like practicing or devout Catholics. they really liked it because Peronism was social justice, but it was very anti-communist. It was fairly, at least at the beginning, socially conservative. Eva herself hated divorce. Eventually, the Peronists would bring in female suffrage, but that was more because women tended to vote for Peron more than men, than out of any real ideological group. So the Catholic Church actually was, broadly speaking, very supportive of Peron and Peronism. This would kind of turn into a disaster later because Peron was personally anti-clericalist, which is kind of bad when a lot of your supporters were that. So a lot of socialists and even communists backed him because they saw him as kind of, okay, they didn't like him because he was a very staunch nationalist, but he was pretty much the best they could hope for. You had a lot of kind of people who were, I guess, kind of patriarchal, and I mean that in a good sense, a lot of kind of people who believed in noblesse oblige who liked Peron. A lot of people saw him as, and his kind of middle path as a way of stopping radical communist takeover by giving the working class some of what they wanted. So when Peron became president, his basic policy was to modernize Argentina. He nationalized, or bought out a lot of the foreign-owned industry. Argentina had basically been an economic colony of the UK and the US, who had owned a whole bunch of things like the railway system, most of the highways. Argentina had made a lot of money from World War II selling its beef and grain and its other agricultural products to war-torn Europe. So he had a large cash reserves to use to buy these out. They undertook massive public works projects. The Argentinian railway system had a whole bunch of different gauges of tracks. It was all standardized. Highways were expanded. They made huge investments into industry, education. Protectionism was brought in. So it kind of had mixed results. Purchasing all this stuff cost a lot of money. And while the Argentinian government didn't really have to go into debt to do it, part of the problem was they had to import a lot of stuff, and Argentina went into a really bad trade deficit. Reconfiguring the economy also took a while, especially when Peron wanted to increase the living conditions of workers so much. So it was kind of a difficult situation. While workers' pay did increase, there was a lot of inflation, there was a lot of economic disruption from his policies. Ultimately, though, I think it was largely successful. Kind of his view was to have a middle plan, economic nationalism. He wanted Argentina to be self-sufficient, to have its own industry, to have a semi-capitalist economy with state regulation. Which is largely, I think to a large extent, I'm a little more free market than him, but I think by and large his policies were fairly good. So it should be noted that a lot of people call him a tyrant and a dictator, and while he kind of ruled in a somewhat kind of populist authoritarian manner, he did win by what was all accounts a free election, the first free election that had happened in nearly 20 years. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. So once he became president, Eva started to get a really big kind of role in the government. And this took place in the form of the Eva Peron Foundation, or the Foundation Eva Peron, if we're going to go with how the Spanish pronounce things. Or how non-English languages do it. So prior to the Foundation Eva Peron, social welfare in Argentina was very, very primitive. Charity work was undertaken by the Société de Beneficia, or I guess the Beneficial Society it would be in English, which was controlled by upper-class elderly women. The famous example of how they dealt with the poor was the orphans who worked for them had to wear blue smocks and had their heads shaved, and at Christmas they were forced into the streets with collecting tins. So social welfare was very primitive, it was very humiliating, it was just generally speaking very unpleasant. So Eva, kind of remembering back to her childhood and living in poverty, and just kind of in the general populist pro-poor policies, founded the Eva Peron Foundation. Now, it was very popular because it was funded primarily by private donations. The Peronist-controlled Congress lavished money on it out of its own fortunes. All the labor unions who loved Peron donated huge sums of money to it. And the government implemented excise taxes on movie tickets, alcohol, cigarettes, kind of luxury goods. And the extra money was sent to the Eva Peron Foundation. It did not receive a lot of money from taxes, though, so it was very popular for that reason. Or sorry, I should say it was popular for that reason. So the Eva Peron Foundation, a lot of people try to attack it as being a Swiss bank account or a slush fund. From what I've read, there isn't really any truth to that. The Eva Peron Foundation took kind of their focus was to kind of help the poor help themselves. So they would give out things like pairs of shoes. They would give out about 400,000 pairs of shoes a year, hundreds of thousands of sewing machines, cooking pots, scholarships for poor children. They'd help the poor build houses. They provide schools, medical clinics, and orphanages to rural areas. They just built a lot of welfare infrastructure and did a lot to try and help them help themselves. Now, the Catholic Church was extremely supportive of this. Eva had a personal priest who was admittedly a Jesuit who said that the need to help the poor had taken over Eva's life. I don't think when people say, well, this was political, there's really no reason things can't be both political and personal. If anything, you try to take things in life that have multiple facets to it. If you want to do something politically helpful, it's a good idea to pick something you're personally passionate about. I don't have any doubt Eva wasn't very passionate about the poor, but the fact that it also really helped her husband in her political career, I'm sure is good as well. So the Eva Peron Foundation vastly improved the living conditions of the poor. Now, there's a lot of controversy about it, etc., but I'm willing to say it was largely a good thing. The biography of Eva Peron stated that because of her foundation, virtually all Argentinians had access to welfare for at least for the first time. Eva also would frequently go out and give money to the poor herself. She would meet people on a daily basis and try to help them. She would go out and kiss the poor and the sick. Argentina was a Catholic country, and the image of her kissing lepers really invoked kind of the image of Christ and saints. So she really took on a religious aspect. One man stated, "I had a sort of literary perception of the people and the poor, and she had given me a Christian one, thus allowing me to become a Christian in the profoundest sense." How devout Eva was as a method, a open question. She had a personal priest who would always go with her and advise her. While I don't think you could say she was very traditionally religious. I think she certainly believed in God and believed in Christ and believed that she had a mission. And she did frequently take communion throughout her life. So I think it's pretty safe to say that she was Catholic. She would also work as much as 20 to 24 hours a day, even though her husband demanded her to stop. So this was Peronism, I think you can say. I kind of like to think of it as right-wing socialism, because it kind of combined Catholic social teaching, and I mean that in kind of the pre-Marxist phase. It kind of combined kind of Christian social conscience with kind of paternalistic ideas, with populism, with unionism. Peron basically believed, kind of like Mussolini did, that the state could mediate between the different classes of society and that they could all work harmoniously together for the good of the nation. So it had a lot of aspects of corporatism. So what wound up happening is the military was getting increasingly irritated with Peron, especially since he attempted to nominate Evita for his vice president when he was running for re-election. Even though they had recently passed Female suffrage, though, there was a lot of pressure on her not to run. Plus, she had cervical cancer at this point in time, and she was not able to. She was just not healthy enough. She continued to faint, extreme weakness, etc. So right after Peron was reelected, she rode with him throughout the city of Buenos Aires. She was unable to stand at this point without support, so she wore oversized coats with frames made of plaster and wire to allow her to stand. So she took massive doses of pain medication, and she was able to attend Peron's inauguration. She was given the title the spiritual leader of the nation, a title that only she has held, and the Peronist Congress passed every honor they could think of onto her. When eventually she died, there was a massive outpouring of grief that went on and on and on. Her speeches and writings became standard fare within Argentinian schools, and she is seen basically as a saint today in Argentina. So Peronism after Peron was kind of an interesting phenomenon. What ultimately kind of happened is Peron took on the church, which proved to be his undoing. Now, there was a number of reasons why the church was justified in breaking with him, such as him attempting to liberalize divorce. There was also a lot, I think, on unjustified things. They had begun to bring in kind of basic health education. I'm not sure if that means basic sex ed or that just means teaching women how to keep themselves clean, if you catch my drift. And they had Peron was a big supporter of sports. He had promoted racing car drivers, boxers, soccer, all kinds of stuff like that. And he'd implemented more sports in schools, and the church was like, no, we can't have physical education. That's too worldly and degenerate and bodily. So I think they were kind of wrong in that respect, but he was going after the church and a lot of others, exiling bishops and stuff. So when the church turned on him and excommunicated him, he lost what had been one of his longest term supporters. In a country that's 99% Catholic, if you're going to alienate the Catholic Church, that's not a good thing. So ultimately, Peron was exiled and returned sometime later to become president again for about a year before his death, and then his third wife succeeded him. Peron and Eva's bodies are interned in a special bunker crypt that is apparently immune to nuclear weapons, and the only key to it is owned by Eva's sister, and I think she plans to toss it into the sea when she dies. And that's just I think, kind of summarizes what a big effect they had on Argentina. To this day, the largest party in the Argentine Congress is the Judicialist Party, Peron's party. Within it, it's so prevalent that they have sub-parties within it. Currently, Republican Proposal, which is kind of the right-wing Peronism, is in power, but you also had left-wing Peronism in the form of Kirchner. Once again, the right-wing Peronists are more amenable to capitalism. They tend to be more nationalist. They tend to be more Catholic and more socially conservative, whereas the left-wing Peronists tend to be, well, the opposite of that, but also more in favor of state management of the economy. So it's kind of hard to make a historical judgment about them. Well, Argentina arguably has never recovered to its glory of pre-World War, the pre-Great Depression. It's debatable whether any leader could have done it. Or it's also debatable whether or not communism would have come to the country if you didn't have a moderate force like Peron to kind of mediate between the different aspects of society. People also have to wonder if how bad or how good his lasting, I guess, kind of changing of political order had on Peron. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Did Peron help the country? Did Peron hurt the country? I'm not really sure. It's kind of one of those issues like the Holocaust or 9/11, which is so heavily politicized by all sides involved, both the people who hate the Perons and both the people who love them, that I don't really know if we can ever make it an objective historical judgment on the man. Overall, I'd say, well, I have a lot of criticisms of them, particularly of their economic policy. I think the Perons probably did more harm than good to Argentina. And I think the lesson that if you refuse to do any reforms, if you refuse to really do anything that the working class wants, then you get a Peron, then you get a populist leader who's going to come in. Historical forces are very strong. Social forces are very strong. And you ignore them at your own peril. Just like the Bourbons' inability to change with the times led to the French Revolution, and the inability of the revolutionaries to moderate and provide an effective government bring about Napoleon, so the Perons came about due to an inability of the conservative ruling class to effectively run the country. I hope you enjoyed that IRL character profile. Sorry I haven't put up much content lately. I've been busy with work, and this one took a lot of research to do. This is Argent. I'll talk to you guys later.